Think about what that night actually looked like. Tens of thousands of people standing on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., the most symbolically charged piece of ground in this country. The 250th anniversary of the nation itself, a moment that happens once in the history of a civilization. And then the sky cracked open. Not metaphorically, literally. Severe thunderstorms tore through the Capitol so fast that security personnel were sprinting, directing crowds of thousands into museums, government buildings, subway stations, anywhere with a roof. The fireworks were delayed. The speech was pushed back hours, and the air temperature at the time of all of this was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. I have been watching weather for a long time. What happened to this country over the July 4th weekend? I want to make sure you understand the full scale of it, because what most people saw was the storm that disrupted the fireworks. What the data actually shows is something much bigger than that. I am Arthur, and this is Sky Space Lab. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now. What I am about to show you touches every corner of this country, and it is not over. Let me lay out exactly what we're dealing with, because the numbers are extraordinary. In the span of roughly 5 days, from late June into July 4th and 5th, the National Weather Service documented record-high temperatures at more than 100 locations across the central and eastern United States. Not near records, not daily records from a quiet Tuesday in 1994. Records that had stood for over a century. Washington, D.C. hit 102 degrees on July 3rd. That broke a mark that had been standing since 1872. 154 years, gone in an afternoon. Philadelphia reached 103. That tied a record from 1901. Newark, New Jersey hit 105 for the first time since 2001. Boston touched 100 degrees. New York City's Central Park hit triple digits, the first time that had happened in nearly 14 years. Atlantic City, New Jersey recorded 106 degrees on July 4th. That is not a near record. That is the city's all-time hottest temperature, ever, on Independence Day. Now, here is where I need you to slow down and think about what that means. All of those cities, Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Newark, Atlantic City, hitting records within 48 hours of each other. The same heat dome, the same locked high-pressure lid, a block of superheated, moisture-saturated air that simply refused to move. The National Weather Service's heat risk product placed over 160 million Americans under major or extreme heat risk at the peak. That is roughly half the country. And because the humidity was so intense, dew points in the low to mid-80s in many areas, overnight lows were not dropping into comfortable territory. Washington's overnight low set an all-time record for warmest minimum temperature at 84 degrees, 84, at night, in July. That is when the body is supposed to recover. It did not get to recover, and that is when heat kills. Let me give you the human cost before I go anywhere else, because I think that matters more than any model run. At least 25 people are confirmed dead from heat-related causes across New Jersey alone as of this morning. The ages range from the mid-30s to the 80s. One confirmed fatality in Pennsylvania, a 68-year-old man in Bethel Township who was trimming bushes outside when temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. His cause of death was a cardiac arrest triggered by heat exhaustion. 51 people were evaluated for heat-related illness at the National Mall celebration events alone, with 12 transported to hospitals. Emergency rooms across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic reported what the Centers for Disease Control described as extremely high rates of heat-related visits. That language, extremely high, comes from people who track these statistics every single day. That is the threshold they use when the numbers are genuinely alarming, and then the storms arrived. The same heat dome that baked the East Coast also loaded the atmosphere with so much instability that when a cold front finally began to press in from the west, the collision was violent. The Storm Prediction Center issued a level 3 out of 5 severe weather risk across the mid-Atlantic on July 4th, covering Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and surrounding areas, simultaneously. On the night of the nation's biggest outdoor event in 250 years, wind gusts hit 70 miles per hour in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Hundreds of trees were knocked down across New Jersey and Michigan. Hundreds of thousands of utility customers lost power in the middle of a dangerous heat wave, the worst combination possible, because the moment air conditioning stops, indoor temperatures begin climbing toward outdoor levels within minutes. By Monday morning, more than 501,000 utility customers remained without power. Pennsylvania and Michigan carried the largest share of outages. Over the entire weekend, PowerOutage.com tracked a total of 1.3 million customers who lost power at some point. Michigan alone saw nearly 472,000 outages, Pennsylvania, 275,000, New Jersey, 250,000. Do you live in any of those states? Were you in that number? Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where you were during this. In Philadelphia, the semi-quincentennial Independence Day parade was cancelled before a single float ever moved. The city had declared a heat health emergency. Crowds along the Benjamin Franklin Parkway were evacuated when storms approached, delaying the concert and fireworks for several hours. The celebration did not resume until after midnight. In Hartford, Connecticut, cancelled. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, cancelled. In Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, cancelled. In Boston, spectators were told to seek shelter before events eventually resumed. In New York City, Macy's moved the fireworks show forward to beat the incoming storm line. And in Washington, the evacuation orders sent thousands of people streaming into the Ronald Reagan Building, the National Museum of American History, the Department of Commerce, the IRS building, every nearby structure that had a door open and air conditioning running. The president eventually spoke at 11:15 in the evening. Lightning was visible in the distance as fireworks launched over the mall. This is one of the most dramatic weather disruptions to a major American national event I have seen in years. But here is what I want to get into now, because the disruption was not the cause. The cause is something deeper, and it connects directly to what happens next across this country over the coming days. The heat dome that triggered all of this did not form by accident. The Storm Prediction Center's Day 4 through 8 outlook, issued this morning on July 7th, describes the evolution of a new ridge, a mid-level and upper-level high building over the lower Colorado Valley and Plateau, beginning later this week and expanding to cover a significant portion of the interior United States by early next week. Let me translate that. The heat that locked over the east is now shifting west. AccuWeather's long-range team has been tracking this transition for days. The pattern flip is already underway. The western United States is about to build its own heat dome, and it is going to precede the North American monsoon, meaning the window between brutal heat and actual monsoon-driven relief could produce very dangerous fire weather conditions across the southwest and southern Rockies. Now, what about the east? What does this week look like for the millions of people still dealing with power outages and flooded streets? Today, Tuesday, July 7th, 34 million people in the northeast remain under a flood watch through late tonight. The Weather Prediction Center is tracking repeated rounds of heavy rain across the mid-Atlantic and northeast corridor. Philadelphia and New York City could pick up an additional 3 to 4 inches of rain between Monday and Tuesday combined, on top of ground that is already saturated from last weekend's storms. Flash flooding in urban areas and low-lying zones is not a distant possibility. It is the primary threat for today. The reason this rain is so persistent is that the same stalled frontal boundary that helped spawn Saturday's severe weather is still draped across the region. It is not moving quickly. And with Atlantic moisture streaming in behind it, training convection, meaning storm after storm develops and moves over the same geography, is exactly what we expect through tonight. Here is who needs to watch this the most right now. New York City. Mayor Zoran Mamdani has already warned residents in basement apartments to be prepared to evacuate if water begins entering their units. The city opened public schools as shelters Sunday evening. Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts remain under a flood watch. Flash flooding has been reported in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, where 2 girls were rescued from floodwaters on July 5th. The saturated soil across a broad swathe of the I-95 corridor means that even moderate rainfall totals can generate significant runoff with very little delay. Updated as of this morning, more than 280,000 customers are still without power across the Northeast. Crew restoration teams from 12 states and Canada have mobilized to Michigan. Pennsylvania has its own ongoing restoration effort, but with additional storm rounds expected today, the threat of new outages before the old ones are repaired is real. Isolated tornadoes remain possible today across the northern plains. The Storm Prediction Center has noted that a surface boundary lifting through the Dakotas along with afternoon heating could support supercell development from southeastern Montana through eastern Wyoming and into South Dakota. The main threats are large hail and damaging wind gusts, but the environment is not unfavorable for rotation if a discrete supercell can organize before storms cluster. This is a secondary threat compared to the flooding in the northeast, but if you are in western South Dakota or eastern Wyoming this afternoon, you need to be paying attention. By Wednesday, July 8th, the severe storm focus shifts into the central Great Plains. The Storm Prediction Center is watching a low-pressure development across western Kansas, with Lee troughing into eastern Wyoming. Storms developing Wednesday afternoon over eastern Wyoming and Colorado could produce hail and locally damaging gusts, with the activity likely to cluster and push into Nebraska and Kansas overnight. The flooding concern eases somewhat in the east by Wednesday, as the front finally begins to lift northward, but residual showers will continue through much of the mid-Atlantic. Thursday, July 10th, brings another round of interest across the central and northern plains and into the middle Mississippi Valley and parts of the mid-Atlantic. The Storm Prediction, sent as day 4 through 8, product specifically identifies scattered strong thunderstorm development, potentially including clusters that could track through that corridor Thursday into Thursday night. It is still early enough that confidence in exact placement is low, but the pattern is supportive. Friday through the weekend, this is where I want to spend some time because this is where the SPC's language gets more pointed. The mid-level and upper-level ridge building over the lower Colorado Valley and Plateau is going to be the dominant feature of the extended pattern. As this high expands and the flow strengthens around its periphery, a plume of very warm elevated mixed layer air, what forecasters call EML, or elevated mixed layer, is expected to be transported along the southern fringe of the intensifying flow around the ridge's northern and northeastern edge. That warm cap, combined with high moisture return from the Gulf, is the recipe for explosive convective development on the right trigger. The trough digging across and southeast of Hudson Bay, the SPC specifically mentioned this feature in this morning's outlook, is what provides that trigger. As it digs south and east later this week into early next week, it will force that EML and Gulf moisture into contact with a sharp mid-level wind maximum. When that happens, the severe weather potential across the northern plains and Great Lakes can escalate very quickly. This is the pattern setup I have been watching develop over the past several days. And it matters because the areas most likely to be impacted, the Great Lakes, the upper Midwest, portions of the Ohio Valley, are the same areas that just endured significant power outages and are in the middle of grid restoration. A severe weather outbreak on top of that recovery window would be an extremely difficult situation for those communities. Let me step back and give you the big picture here, because I think there is something larger that needs to be said about what we just witnessed. The World Weather Attribution Group, a scientific network that specializes in rapid attribution of extreme events to climate change, published an analysis last Friday. Their conclusion was stark. The intensity of this heat wave, the combination of heat and humidity that we saw across the eastern United States last week, would have been, in their words, virtually impossible in a world 1.4 degrees Celsius cooler than today. Think about that number carefully. 1.4 degrees. The global average warming that we have measured since the pre-industrial baseline. And within that 1.4 degrees of warming, an event like what just devastated the July 4th holiday, that event moves from virtually impossible to reality. The mechanism is not complicated once you understand how a heat dome forms. A strong area of upper-level high pressure parks over a region and acts as a lid. It prevents the normal mixing of the atmosphere, sinking air beneath the high compresses and heats as it descends, just like air heats in a bicycle pump when you push down fast. The lid holds the heat in place. Day after day, the surface temperature ratchets higher because there is no mechanism to release it. What climate change does to this process is load the baseline. The atmosphere underneath the lid is already warmer than it was 50 years ago. The humidity is higher because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, and water vapor is itself a potent greenhouse gas, which amplifies the heating further. The overnight lows that used to allow some recovery are now 6 to 10 degrees warmer than they once were. The human body does not have a night cycle of true relief, and when the storms finally come, they carry more moisture and more energy, which is exactly what we saw on July 4th. This is not a new story in atmospheric science, but the scale of what happened last week, 160 million people under heat risk simultaneously, 25 confirmed deaths in a single state, The hottest July 4th in Washington, D.C.'s recorded history going back to the 1800s. This is not normal. This is not background noise. This is one of the strongest documented convergences of heat dome intensity and major event disruption I have seen in years of tracking this data. Now, and here is where I pivot, because I want to make sure you understand why the coming weeks matter. This pattern shift is not just about heat moving west. The NOAA Climate Prediction Center has been signaling for several weeks that El Niño is strengthening. The ENSO diagnostic discussions out of the Climate Prediction Center describe sea surface temperature anomalies in the Nino 3.4 region, approaching positive 1 degree Celsius, borderline moderate El Niño territory, as of early July. That matters for what happens with the summer storm pattern, because El Niño drives wind shear across the tropical Atlantic, suppressing hurricane development. It also reinforces the subtropical jet across the southern tier of the United States, which keeps moisture flowing and maintains storm track options across the Central Plains and Great Lakes corridor. The combination of the shifting ridge, western heat dome building, eastern trough deepening, and El Niño's ongoing influence on the subtropical jet creates a pattern that the SPC's medium-range forecast this morning described with notable specificity. Elevated mixed-layer transport along the ridge periphery, storm track focused from the northern plains through the Great Lakes and potentially into the northeast, and a period of increasing severe weather potential into the middle of July. Have you seen your area get hit multiple times in the past 30 days? Are you somewhere in the Midwest or Ohio Valley right now watching this unfold? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now let me give you the 7-day breakdown by date so you know exactly what to expect. Tuesday, July 7th, today. Northeast and mid-Atlantic flood threat is the primary story. 34 million under flood watch. 3 to 4 additional inches of rain possible for Philadelphia and New York. Flash flooding in urban areas and low-lying zones is the main risk. Isolated severe storms in the northern plains, South Dakota, eastern Wyoming, with large hail and tornado risk secondary. Wednesday, July 8th. Flood threat begins to ease in the east as the front slowly progresses. Severe storm threat develops in eastern Wyoming and Colorado during the afternoon, spreading into Nebraska and Kansas overnight. Main threats: large hail and damaging wind gusts. Ongoing power restoration across Michigan and Pennsylvania could be complicated by additional storm activity. Thursday, July 10th. Storm Prediction Center identifies this as a day of interest across the central and northern plains and into the middle Mississippi Valley. Scattered strong to severe thunderstorms possible, potentially including organized clusters. Confidence in exact placement still limited at this range, but the pattern is supportive. Friday and Saturday, July 11th and 12th. The western heat dome begins consolidating in earnest. Temperatures across Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California's interior valleys will push well into the 100s. AccuWeather's long-range team has flagged this as the beginning of a significant western heat event that will precede the North American monsoon onset around mid-July. For the central United States, the SPC's extended pattern suggests an elevated risk corridor that cannot be pinned to a single day yet, but the combination of ridge, EML transport and boundary lifting creates the conditions for potentially organized severe weather across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Sunday, July 13th through Tuesday, July 15th. This is the period I am watching most closely right now. The trough deepening across and south of Hudson Bay, combined with the fully developed western ridge, puts the storm track squarely across the northern plains and Great Lakes. The SPC's language, very warm, elevated, mixed-layer air, advecting along the southern fringe of the intensifying flow, is forecaster language for a significant convective setup. Whether this becomes an outbreak-level event or a series of isolated severe storms depends on the exact timing of the trigger, how well the low-level jet establishes, and how organized the boundary layer moisture is. But here is what I can tell you with confidence. The pattern is not relaxing. It is reorganizing. The east is shifting from heat to flood. The west is building toward a new heat event. The central United States is caught between those two regimes, and that zone of transition, historically, is where the most significant tornado and severe weather days emerge in July. Before we close out today, I want to bring something into focus that has been sitting in the background of all of this: the power grid story. Because I think it tells you something important about what the next few years of weather are going to look like. The PJM interconnection grid, the regional operator covering the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest, home to more than 65 million people, came under emergency conditions during last week's heat dome. Energy Secretary Chris Wright issued a formal emergency order under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act. That order allowed grid operators to move large data centers onto their own backup generators. It also temporarily waived pollution limits so that idled power plants could return to service faster to meet demand. Let that register for a moment. The federal government had to issue an emergency order during a heatwave in July, the month when summer demand normally peaks, because the grid was under strain it could not handle otherwise. The reason I bring this up is meteorological consequence. A grid under emergency strain during a heat dome is a grid that fails faster when the storms arrive. When the severe thunderstorms on July 4th knocked down trees and power lines across New Jersey, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, those outages hit a system that had already been running at maximum capacity for days. Crews were already stretched, equipment was already stressed, and the result was 1.3 million customer outages over the holiday weekend, with more than 500,000 still in the dark as of Monday morning. This is what happens when a heat dome and a severe weather event collide in the same system at the same time. It is not just uncomfortable. It is a cascading failure across multiple infrastructure systems simultaneously: transportation, utilities, emergency services, public health. Amtrak cancelled more than 24 trains in the Northeast Corridor during the peak heat period because heat causes rail lines to buckle and expand beyond safe operational tolerances. And here is the thing about the coming week. The flood threat continuing today and tomorrow adds more saturated soil, more swollen streams, and more debris to a region that has not fully cleared the last round. Any additional severe weather this week, and the SPC is telling us it is coming, lands on that foundation. One more thing I need to address before tomorrow's video, and this is the part that deserves more attention than it is currently getting. The rainfall totals across the Northeast this week are not just a cleanup problem. They're arriving on top of something that has been quietly building for weeks. The soil moisture anomalies across much of the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and the northern Mid-Atlantic have been running above average for most of June. The same storminess that kept the Midwest wetter than normal during late spring, driven in part by the developing El Niño's influence on the southern branch of the jet stream, set the table for what we are seeing now. When the atmosphere delivers repeated heavy rain events onto already saturated soil, the hydraulic response changes. Streams that would normally handle a 2-inch rainfall event with moderate rises are now generating flash flooding on less than an inch because the soil simply cannot absorb any more. That is not a weather phenomenon in isolation. That is an interaction between antecedent conditions and the current forcing. The practical implication today is this. If you are in New York City, in New Jersey, in southeastern Pennsylvania, in Rhode Island, in southeastern Massachusetts, the flood watch through tonight is not a precautionary watch issued because there is a small chance of problems. It is a watch issued because the models are indicating that training cells along this boundary are going to repeatedly hit the same geography. That is the environment for significant urban flooding events. Do not attempt to drive through flooded roadways today. Turned-around vehicles account for a significant portion of flood fatalities in events exactly like this one. 6 inches of moving water can knock a person off their feet. 12 inches can carry a vehicle. If you encounter a flooded roadway in the area I just described, turn around. That decision has to happen before you're in the water, not after. This is the context the headlines miss. The fireworks story, the DC evacuation, the cancelled parades, those are the images that get shared. But the full scope of what just moved through this country over 5 days includes records from 1872, 25 deaths in New Jersey, a federal grid emergency order, 1.3 million power outages, flash flooding with active rescues in Pennsylvania, and a pattern that is now reorganizing for another active chapter. If there is one thing I want you to take from today's video, it is this. What happened over the July 4th weekend was not an isolated extreme. It was one chapter of a larger story about how the atmosphere is behaving during the summer of 2026. The pattern does not end here. It shifts, and the next shift is already visible in the data. Watch this channel, share this with someone who needs to understand what is coming, and I will be back tomorrow with updated numbers. Tomorrow I will be watching the flood situation in the Northeast specifically, whether additional training convection tonight adds significantly to totals in Philadelphia and New York, and whether any flash flood emergencies are issued before midnight. If this video gave you something useful today, if it helped you understand not just what happened but why and what comes next, please hit like and subscribe. This channel exists to give you the full picture, not just the headlines. And the full picture right now is a country still in the middle of a significant weather period, with more to come. Stay weather aware, stay safe. I will see you tomorrow.